I'm personally very much looking forward to. I think that's going to be a great conversation. So today we have Laura Limonic, is an associate professor of sociology at the College of Westbury at the State University of New York. Her research is in the area of contemporary immigration to both the United States and the integration trajectories of ethnic and ethnic religious groups. Super interesting. Her book, Cugo and Frijoles, Latino Jews in the United States, explores issues of ethnicity, race, class, and religious community building among Latino Jewish immigrants in Boston, New York, Miami, and Southern California. Hey, I'm from there. So everybody, please, a virtual round of applause for Laura. Thank you so much. Please take it away.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. And thank you very much for having me. I'm going to talk a little bit about exactly what Eric mentioned, Latinx Jews. Who are Latinx Jews? What are they doing here? How do they fit in? What does it mean to be Latinx, Latino, Hispanic, and Jewish? So I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to start some slides that I've put together. Play from start. So how can you be Jewish? Aren't you Latina? How can a white girl like you speak Spanish so well? Oh, you're from Venezuela. Are you thinking of converting? These were some of the snippets of conversations that some of them, the first one I got all the time. What, aren't you Jewish? Are you Latina? I don't really get it. There's this sort of cognitive dissonance that's involved in thinking about when we think about our fixed ideas of what ethnicity and race and religion should be. So I grew up in suburban Boston, an area with a large Jewish population, and I was often asked these sorts of questions. And it seemed odd to me at the time that people might not know that Jewish communities exist worldwide, especially since I am certain that many of my former classmates in suburban Boston could probably trace our great-grandparents to the nearby shtetls or communities in Eastern Europe. My family's Jewishness was practiced in much the same way that other American families express their traditions and culture. But nonetheless, I struggled with finding an identity. That throughout college, later in graduate school, I joined the Latina Students Association. But I always sort of felt like a little bit of an imposter. Am I this? Am I that? So when I started doing preliminary research, I found that many immigrants of Jewish descent had similar experiences of not fully belonging to any one ethnic group or ethno-religious group. So the beginning of my research really set out to understand how people identify in terms of race and ethnicity, how religion plays a role here, and how identity shifts in different situations and across divergent groups. So I set out to interview people, and I interviewed about 85 people, and I came to see that these questions really led to even bigger questions about the role of ethnicity and ethno-religion in the process of assimilation, in the process of upward or downward mobility among immigrants. And also the idea, it really led me to think more about the idea of ethnic construction and the reproduction of ethno-religious communities. So in part, I really wanted to understand who decides what ethnicity they can be or are assigned to. How are communities formed? How are they reconstructed? Who's allowed into the communities and who's always an outsider? So the story of Latinx Jews in the United States, the story of Latinx Jewish immigrants in the United States, is essentially a story of immigration. So assimilation or incorporation into a new country is accomplished not only, as we know, through socioeconomic advances, language acquisition or acculturation, but also inevitably involves changes in ethnic identity. And we think about this, for example, in terms of when we think about the larger pan-ethnic groups here in the United States. Mexicans are Mexican. They're not Latinx, Latino until they come here. We know the same often happens for folks of of Middle Eastern descent, or of some Asian or East Asian descent. Their national country of origin plays an outsized role in their identity, but their identity shifts. They become oftentimes minorities in a country where not everybody is like them, and this is the case for particularly for Jewish Latinos. But they're also, they also find that their ethnicity and their race and their ethno-religion falls in different places within the US hierarchical line. So what happens with Latinx Jews? Well, Latinx Jewish immigrants are essentially assimilate and change to some extent their ethnic identity. I'm very interested in understanding, what do we mean by ethnic options? So ethnic options, who gets to decide? How do immigrants navigate the different ethnic and racial categories in the United States? How is insider status within existing racial and ethnic groups achieved? How does membership in an ethnic and racial group influence life chances? And to what extent are immigrants able to define their own ethnic and racial identities to situate themselves within American society? So let me just break this, we can just sort of unpack this because that's a lot to think about. But in many ways, immigrants come here and find a racial schema, a racial paradigm, a racial order that is different from what it was in their home country. And oftentimes they would like to insert themselves in a way that would help them assimilate, integrate, achieve upward mobility. But in many ways, on the one hand, they need to learn the lay of the land. And on the other hand, it really has to do about where they get assigned and what choices. We like to say, what kind of agency do you have in making these choices in these group constructions? So I was really interested in thinking about, how do immigrants choose or get assigned to an ethnic group, and what constraints do they face in the process? And in this particular group of immigrants, we have something called situational ethnicity, right? There's a number of different ethnicities to draw from. Sometimes they can be Jewish, they can be Argentine, Mexican, Latinx, Jewish Latinos. When do they choose one over the other? And the third one that I think becomes very interesting is this idea of panethnicity. What does it mean to be Latino or Latinx or Asian, right? Is it a made up identity? Or do people over time begin to construct a real identity around these terms? So these are sort of the guiding questions and outlines that have really guided my research and thinking about these kinds of topics. So I want to think about first a little bit of the history of Jews in Latin America. We often think about Jewish migrant Jews in Latin America as coming with, as Jews that came with the Inquisition, which is absolutely true. There were a number of Jews that left of the Iberian Peninsula and went to Latin America during the Inquisition. Those members or sort of the descendants of those Jews that left were were essentially stopped practicing Judaism for a number of reasons. It was illegal. There's accounts of being burned at the stake. And over time, they lost any religious affiliation. So contemporary Jewish communities in Latin America really come from the same migration streams that came here to the United States. So in many ways, when we think about migration, we think about the push and the pull factors, right? What are the push factors that tend to force or really push people to migrate, to leave their home countries? Oftentimes, it's economic. We tend to think that it's political. There's persecution. That is absolutely true. For the Jews, it's probably a combination, but a large part of it is economic. The Jews in Europe, as well as the Italians, the Irish, the Poles, the Slavics, were facing a great economic downturn in Europe. The fall of the Ottoman Empire also propelled a lot of Jews to leave. Post-war, refugees left, whatever Jews were left in Europe were also forced to migrate out. So it was really the same migration streams that went to the United States, went to Latin America. In the late 1800s, this photograph here is a photograph. We see here the year is 1889. So Jews began coming for Argentina in the late 1800s to rural colonies that were a program that was developed or constructed by Baron Hirsch, and these were called the colonies of Baron Hirsch. They existed also in Canada, and the idea was to help Jews leave Europe and form agricultural communities all over the world. So they were in rural areas of Argentina, and they're dressed as gauchos. Gauchos is what we call the Argentine cowboy. So this is the way that they sort of became part of the national Argentine folklore. They really they really embody the Argentine culture. These communities, however, were short-lived, and over time, the Jews moved to the larger urban areas, particularly Buenos Aires, and they were joined by co-religionists at the turn of the century. Argentina was one of the fastest growing economies at the time and really welcomed immigrants to the country. Like Argentina, other Latin American countries also welcomed Jews and other European immigrants. Colombia, Chile, Brazil are some examples. In Mexico, Jews also migrated to Mexico at the turn of the century. They didn't establish communities until after the Mexican Revolution. Venezuela, which had one of the largest Jewish communities, was primarily a community that was started by Moroccan Jewish immigrants, later joined by Holocaust survivors. So as different regimes took over other parts of the world, Jews came to the United States or Latin America. Most Jews wanted to come to the United States because they would get letters. Oh, the streets are, we hear this all the time. The streets are paved with gold. Come to the United States. What happens in the United States in 1924 is that Congress passes an act called the Johnson-Reed Act. And the Johnson-Reed Act said, you know what? These people, we don't want them anymore. We don't want any more Jews. We don't want any more Italians. We don't want any more Poles, Slavs, enough. This is when we start to see the real migration, a real push for migration to other countries in Latin America. So really, the Jews wanted to leave. They left, they went to whatever country would take them in. But here's where things turn different. So we like to think that Jews are Jews all over the world. Sephardic Jews, Mizrahi Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, in other words, Jews from the Middle East, from North Africa, from Eastern Europe. And in some ways, they share a religion, but their ethno-religion is quite different. Why is it quite different? Because it's influenced by the part of the world where they come from. And the same holds for Latin America. So Jews in Latin America, even if they're from the same migration streams as the ones here in the United States, face very different national cultures and institutions, which result in very different kinds of Jewish communities. Latin America is predominantly Catholic. Catholicism is the civil religion and often the state religion of many countries across Latin America, which as a result, Jews were always and continue to be religious minorities and religious outsiders. That Jewish life in Latin America continues to be much more tight-knit in ways that it was once here in the United States, but has remained so for various structural reasons. For example, Jewish communities continue to be concentrated around large urban areas. There's an important structure of Jewish day schools, and in large part this has to do with the fact that the state doesn't often provide the kind of public institutions that exist here in the United States. So when families faced with sending their child to a private school often chooses to send their child to a Jewish day school, which again acts as a cohesive bond for Jewish groups in Latin America. There have strong Kehillah model. Kehillah is a sort of central organizing institution under which it's sort of an umbrella institution under which other institutions are organized. And as a result, there's a large, Jewish life in Latin America has sort of, there's a large secular, cultural, athletic, and non-religious Jewish ethno-religious identity and community in Latin America, which I argue doesn't exist in the same way here in the United States. And I just want to talk a little bit about this photograph, because one of the things that I think is very important is to think about how national culture influences ethno-religious identity and construction. So this is the Western Wall in Jerusalem. And this is the Argentine Jewish women's soccer team. And they're all wearing the Argentine jersey. Our soccer is popular all over the world. I think in Argentina, it's a very big point of pride. So this is how they chose to express both their Argentine and Jewish identity in a very Argentine way. This over here is a kosher taqueria in Mexico City. It's called Klein's. And again, one of the ways that Jewish Mexicans express their identity is through food. And some of it is kosher, some of it is not kosher, but it's very much influenced by the local culture. So in the United States, to contrast what's happening in Latin America, the Jews in the United States arrived to a country where religious pluralism was a norm, or is a norm enshrined in the Constitution. And this facilitated the change of Jews from an ethno-racial group to an ethno-religious one, which I think is an important one, because religion in the United States among Jews continues to be at the center of Jewish community. The synagogues, however much we can talk about declining synagogue membership, is the way, particularly as Jews left core urban areas, the way that Jews could have an institutional affiliation with Jewish life. So what happens when they come here? I set out to really understand, okay, well, what's going on? In what circumstances, when Jewish Latin American immigrants come to the United States, how are they going to identify? Are they going to be Latinx Jewish, Latinx Jewish? So under what circumstances are they able to highlight one identity or ethno-religious identity over another? And embedded in this question is the role that race plays in the larger construction of ascribed and assigned ethnicities. Who is able to choose, and what does that mean for the larger concept of ethnic assignation, right? So who gets to choose whether they're sometimes Latinx and sometimes not? And I will argue that it largely has to do in many ways with race. So I wanted to really understand not only how people choose, but if people are sometimes Latinx, sometimes Jewish, sometimes Latinx Jewish, is there a real Latinx Jewish group that emerges? Do members of this group feel an affinity, feel ties to other Jewish Latinx people? So what happens when Jews come here? What does it mean to be, what happens when Latinx Jews come to the United States? So unlike Latin America, synagogues continue to be at the center of Jewish life. So here's a quote that I can read to you. and this is from an Argentine Jewish immigrant in Boston that I interviewed, and she said, you know what, most Argentines don't go to synagogue to pray, or I don't even remember going very often. We have other ways to interact and be Jewish. Our whole world can be Jewish if we want to. So she says, I went to Jewish schools and then Hebraica, which is one of the largest community athletic centers in Buenos Aires. But here we don't have that. There's the JCC, and it fulfills some of the same functions. And she said, in fact, this summer we're going there so we can interact with other members of the community at the pool, but it's not really the same. And then she goes on to say, I tried to join a synagogue, but I don't feel connected to it. So as Jews have become members of the mainstream in the US and ethnicity lost its edge, religiosity, even if it's just for high holy days, right? The Jewish New Year and the Day of Atonement took center stage. So the way for Jews to practice Judaism in the US is through religious institutions. And as we know from lots of research is that it's okay to be religious in this country. It's not okay to be racially different. And what do I mean racially different? I mean how you're accepted, your life chances. But religiosity to some extent religiosity of different religions tends to be much more accepted. In fact, the United States is one of the most highly religious countries in the Western world. So Latin American Jews come here, and it doesn't mean that they don't join synagogues or they don't necessarily identify as Jewish. In fact, the opposite is true. It does mean that they don't feel the same kind of sense of Jewish communal identity. So one thing that became apparent when I interviewed people is that they sort of felt like, of course I'm Jewish and I feel accepted sometimes, right? In large part, Jews in Latin America, as I mentioned, are used to operating within tight-knit, closed communities. A majority, of course, not all of them. So we can sort of unpack that later in the discussion. But this doesn't necessarily exist in the same way here in the United States. So when I asked them how they, how do they feel? I asked lots of questions to these 85 respondents that ranged from sort of first adult immigrants from Argentina, Mexico, Venezuela were the primary countries, followed by a number of people from Colombia and Puerto Rico. So I asked them, what does it mean to be Jewish here? And they said, well, one thing that they found was that there's a kind of what we call ethnic capital, right? It's a reciprocal capital. When we sociologists talk about capital, we talk about human capital, which is sort of the skills, social capital, which is the people we know, and ethnic capital, which is kind of a connections along ethnic lines, is how I define it. So being Jewish makes you or allows you insider status, particularly in these areas where the majority of Latinx Jews have migrated to. This is especially true in New York, where Jewish culture influences so much of what we think of as New York culture. They were also able to access their Jewish identity in strategic ways. These respondents show that by signaling their Jewishness, they're strategically distancing themselves from whom they deem as racialized, from the racialized Latino ethnicity. They are Latinx, but they're different. And this is sort of unpopular, I think, in some ways, because it's controversial, but it's an important thing to point out, because we need to be, in order for us to, I believe, dismantle a racial system, we need to really openly talk about race and who it privileges. So, and importantly, this is also very different from the way they were in their home countries, where being Jewish othered them. Okay, they may have been privileged. A large majority of Latinx Jews or Latin American Jewish communities are middle class or upper middle class, but many of them don't have real insider status because of their Jewishness. Whereas being Jewish in these large urban metropolitan cities where these immigrants settle tends to give them insider status. And additionally, we can see that people use ethnicity as a conduit for trust. Being Jewish, right, signals to others that they're like them, right? You can be trusted because we have something in common. This happens not just among Jews, this happens among other ethnic groups and other immigrants. Sometimes it's an imagined connection, but oftentimes we make these connections because we want to trust other people and we want other people to trust us. So sharing this common bond might result in special treatment in what we call a transference of ethnic capital. I see that there's a bunch of chats. Should I? I'm not. I'm sorry. I'm going to answer all of these later, all the chats later, in case people are putting things up there. So they're Jewish, but they're also not really Jewish in the way that maybe American Jews are, and they, in large part, because they have a strong Latinx identity. This is Adriana, who's an Argentine professor from New York. She says, speaking Spanish creates a special, distinct connection. In general, speaking a language creates a connection when I'm in stores or restaurants. It establishes a kind of intimacy with servers I enjoy. It's a pleasant, quick moment of intimacy. This seems so trite, right? This seems like, oh, so what? But as we go through our day, probably pre-pandemic more so, these are the moments that make up our day. These are the way that we feel connected to the world. So in many ways, there are connections that we make with other people that then come back and form part of our identities of who we are in the world. This Amanda said, you know, I have a Latina identity, and she goes on to say the language, the way of dancing, the music. She says, how I see the mystery of life, everything, even how I laugh. And she goes on to say, even how we die is different, right? So there's a strong cultural element that they can't take away from their own idea of their sense of self, of their construction of sense of self, which often is different from an American Jewish identity. So Adriana, like Adriana, many respondents had a cultural connection to other Latinos when they spoke of, particularly when they spoke about what they termed Latino values, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later. These are strong family values or a certain joy for life that respondents felt lacked among non-Jewish Latinos. So even if their Latinx identity is situational, it is still salient, right? And for example, all but one of my interviews was in Spanish. And again, to think back, thinking back about this idea of class and race, which is very hard to disentangle, I would argue. The majority of the respondents, for example, saw some benefits gained, saw some benefits by being or identifying as Latinx, but many of them would identify as European or white. Now, about 80% of Jewish people in Latin America are Ashkenazi descent, which is Eastern European descent, so they phenotypically read as white. About 20% are not, though it changes with country to country. But oftentimes in the United States, they work hard to signal themselves as part of a majority group, in large part because they see sometimes racialized disadvantages in many ways to being part of a racialized minority group. Many of them would use, for example, Federico says, there are perhaps some advantages to being Latino, especially when you apply to school. If we have some time, I'd love to think more about affirmative action, right? The idea of righting the wrongs of history and who affirmative action should be serving and who it really does serve. Because in large part, all of the people that I interview and absolutely qualify as Latinx, but I would argue that it's likely that affirmative action policies are not necessarily set up to for these sorts of people. Nonetheless, we see that these immigrants don't necessarily have a problem. Some of them do, but not all of them. So I think these quotes illustrate the importance of seeing race and the privilege of whiteness here for many of these people. Again, not all of them. Many Latinx Jews are white Latinx people and call on their Jewishness oftentimes to differentiate themselves from the larger non-white Latinx population. They also call on reclaimed class schemes from their home countries, and often find that even if they have experienced what we call downward mobility, so they might earn less money, or professionally they don't have a job that was as prestigious, or they don't own a home, they see themselves as more educated perhaps, or think back of what their life was like in their home country to construct a sense of self that that is similar to their class status in their home country. So I really wanted to think about, so we sort of thought, well, sometimes they're Jewish, sometimes they're Latinx. We might think that, well, if they don't really fit in with one group or another, we would assume that a Latinx Jewish ethnicity and community would be constructed and emerge. So I wanted to see, well, does this really happen? And I found that it happens sometimes. So how does it happen? This can tell us really, this particular group can really tell us a lot about the possibility of ethnic building and the construction of panethnicity. So I'm going to just unpack this for you. So I found that ethnicity and ethnic communities, particularly panethnic and panethnic communities, are built or not built depending on 3 factors. The demographics, in other words, who is coming? Are they families? Are they singles? Are they professionals? Historical timeline of when they came, right? So for example, what does the existing community look like when they come? Is it a strong existing community that they can slot right into? Or is there an existing community that is either dying out or is ripe for change? And where? Location and geography. So what are the physical structures? We often don't think about this, but I invite you to think about this when you go through your day, how physical structures help or don't help community building. Are there public spaces? Are there municipal offerings? Do people live in buildings or houses? How do they interact? So I compared for this particular section two locations. This is a map of the New York City subway. I should mention that I live over here somewhere in New York City. It's not a very big, Manhattan is not very big. New York City itself is very big. So why am I putting this up? Because I wanted to show that while New York City is interconnected, our subway system used to be amazing. Now, we've had some trouble as of late, but it's very, very difficult to find housing, get around, travel from, I live over here. It might take me, a good hour to get up here, okay? This is where one of the, over here, there's a synagogue that's run by an Argentine rabbi. I'm not gonna go, it takes too long. So this is, I really wanted to sort of show how, when we think about geography, right? How geography is going to influence our possibilities for interaction. But let me just take a step back and think about New York City. Who comes to New York City? Well, the majority of people that comes to New York City are going to be couples or singles. It's very, very expensive to come here as a family. In fact, most people that come as a family bypass the city altogether and move to the suburbs. So what does that mean in terms of community building? We know that in terms of ethno-religious institutions and offerings, it tends to be families that take advantage of them the most. For synagogues, for preschools, for later in life, for communities, that singles and professionals often come to study or for jobs, where they're building communities at school or at their work. They're much less likely to go to a JCC, to go to a synagogue. They also have come at a time when, well, New York City is a Jewish town. If you, I don't know how many of you have come to New York City, but they still sell knishes on the street. Our movers are called schleppers. Being Jewish is part of the mainstream here in New York City. And as one respondent told me, you know, I don't have to do anything to be Jewish because just being in New York makes me feel Jewish. And there's little institutional support for Jewish Latinos. One place that's different is something called the Jewish Latin Center, which is a Chabad center that has worked very hard to bring Jewish Latinx people, young professionals together, and has essentially, by offering institutional support, formed a true pan-ethnic group. And how do we know this? Well, people from different subnational groups or national groups, sub-ethnic groups or national groups have married. And as a result, their group has become a network of Colombian Jews, Mexican Jews, Venezuelan Jews, and a real sort of new Latinx Jewish culture and network has emerged. This is what we call a Purim party, which is a kind of a costume party here at the Jewish Latinx Center. So I said I was going to compare two places. So that was New York. Now we're going to take Florida, South Florida. Aventura is is a little town right next to right in North Miami, right north of North Miami Beach. It's part of Miami-Dade County. And when I want to think about the demographics, who comes here? Well, oftentimes it's families that come here. Why? It's cheaper. Some of them already had apartments here or housing. Okay. They often don't come to study, in large part because there's a few universities, but it's not the place to come to study. Many times the people come as entrepreneurs. It's an easier cost of entry. It's a majority Latinx town. People speak Spanish, and so that's the sort of the historical timeline. So when are they coming? Well, they're coming at a time of an aging population. The population of Jewish people in Miami is dying out. Existing institutions are dying out, and new retirees often bypass Miami altogether and go further north. So you have all of these existing infrastructures without people to fill them. So what do you think the immigrants do? They come and they reconstruct and remake these institutions. And that's happened at synagogues, that's happened at the local JCC, where you often hear more Spanish than English. It's happened at some of the Jewish day schools. And then there is a lot more public space that is conducive, in large part because it's small, but it's conducive to building networks. So in many ways, Aventura is ripe for providing the kind of support for building a true pan-ethnic group and identity. So does pan-ethnicity happen? Well, it depends. I would argue that in New York City, with its entrenched communities, individual level of migration and geographic constraints, a lack of institutional support, it is much less likely to occur, and depends on outside institutions like the Jewish Latin Center. But in South Florida, we see an emerging cultures that, so we know that Sure, folks hang out with people from their hometown, but more and more groups include Venezuelan Jews, Argentine Jews, Peruvian Jews, and they intermarry and form a true pan-ethnic group. These friendships sometimes are struck at Hebraica, which is the sort of Spanish arm of the local JCC. This is the local Café con Tora, which is at one of the synagogues where there are Spanish language services and English language services, or at the pool, these community places, communal places, the Hillel Day School. And we see that national Jewish identities begin to be subsumed and a larger pan-ethnic identity begins to emerge. So I wanted to go back and think, so this is this idea of pan-ethnicity, and I wanted to go back and really think to add another layer and thinking about what this means for bridging, for building bridges. So Feldstein Soto just won the city attorney post in LA. And she writes, this is from the LA Times, she writes, she told the crowd, I call myself a Jewtina, right? Jewish values include doing justice and doing good. Latina values include collaboration, getting the job done, solving the problem of transparency. I would argue that neither of these values are either Latina or Jewish, right? I would argue that they're probably values that many people hold across many ethnic groups. Nonetheless, she's using her ethnicity and her identity to appeal to a greater audience and to build bridges and to build coalitions. This has happened a number of times in the political arenas, and this is where we really begin to see how pan-ethnicity begins to happen on a larger political scale. So she follows in the footsteps of Mayor Eric Garcetti, who is also a Jewtino, and is really working to build bridges across two of the most dominant ethnic groups in Los Angeles. And I just want to leave you with two things. So new directions for immigrant incorporation, and this has to do with newer research that I've been doing on the on religiosity and Chabad Lubavitch. So Chabad Lubavitch are an Orthodox arm of Jews who are based here in Brooklyn with outposts all over the world. So they've become a real transnational religion. And one of the phenomenons that's happening in Latin America, and as a result is also happening among Latinx Jews here in the United States, is that we're beginning to see a rise in religiosity. So not just among Jews, but we begin to see it among, for example, Pentecostals. So there has been a large conversion of Catholics to Pentecostals, as well as Chabad and other Jewish Orthodox groups. And new immigrants are becoming members or joining or attending or affiliating with what we call these Chabad centers at much larger rates than ever before, and particularly and I want to show you this photograph because we often think that what happens is that this man right here in the middle with the tie and the beard is the rabbi, and he dresses in traditional garb, but Chabad is very welcoming to all kinds of people, and you don't necessarily need to dress modestly to go there. So we see, and I wanted to show you this, that this is a Chabad party. And most of the women are bearing shoulders, they might be wearing bare legs, they're very much welcome. And it's one way where Chabad has drawn in many of these new immigrants. It's happening among Latinx immigrants who often act as transnational actors, right? So they become more involved in Chabad in the United States and bring it back to their home countries, and vice versa. It also happens among other kinds of immigrants that are not from Latin America. We see this among South African immigrants, Israeli Jewish immigrants, and immigrants from the former Soviet Union. So we can talk about that later if we have a little bit of time. So just some further questions and some concluding thoughts. I think ethnicity matters, ethno-religion matters, and people can access ethnicity as a conduit for social mobility and exchange for capital. But it also fortifies their self-identity, which is important in an immigrant's journey. So I do want to say that a lot of my research until recently, the Chabad research is new, took place before the Trump administration. So I would argue that the status of Jews as a majority has shifted somewhat in the United States since then. Nonetheless, Jews and Jewish immigrants continue to access conduits for upward mobility. But we'll see what will happen in the future. And I think this hopefully will leave us with a lot of questions. Are we going to see more bridge building between Latinx people and Jewish people? What will happen with the children of Latinx Jewish immigrants? Will they blend into the larger American Jewish community, or will we begin to see real formation of Latinx Jewish identities? I primarily concentrate on immigrants, but I think one important factor is really thinking about the Latinx Jews where one parent is a non-Jewish Latino and one parent is Jewish, and how that translates into identity and identity construction. And so thank you very, very much for listening, and I look forward to all of your questions. Let me stop share. Okay.
So thank you, Laura, so very much for that presentation. I learned several things out of that. Absolutely. I do want to go there. I do see some questions out there in the chat. I'll read them off here from Gabriel. This person is curious if folks that you interviewed struggle to answer race and ethnicity questions on Census Bureau forms in the US. I will say for me personally, I always have trouble. I've only done it twice, but I have trouble answering that question myself. So throw it out there.
Sure. I think that's a very, very, very interesting question. And absolutely, I ask people all the time. That was one of my, that was part of my question, my process. And I continue to ask people. A lot of what I get is, I don't know. I'm not sure what I put on the census. You'd be surprised at how many people don't fill out the census. So there's a couple of interesting things that have happened since I undertook this research. Is that the census is also that it's fascinating how the census came up with this idea of Hispanic or Latino and why, right? But also it's changed. So the latest census has changed the order, which might seem like not that big of a deal, but it's actually asking people to say, are you Latino or Hispanic? And then asking them for a racial identity. And it used to be different. It's also, the question used to say, are you Argentine, Chilean, and sort of went in alphabetical order. Now the question actually asks, are you, and ask the largest Latino groups, the Latin American origin groups first. And I don't even know if Argentina is part of it, for example, which then really begs the question, how structure, how institutions in many ways influence this assignation of ethnic identity. So how will it change? Absolutely, it changes. And one of the things that there's two very interesting things that I would like to think about is, one is that people, if given a choice, they might put white European And this even happened among folks who were Sephardic, so from let's say Spanish or some Middle Eastern. It was very important for many of these immigrants to see themselves as European or other. We know the Latinx people often choose other. But I recently did a new study that has nothing to do with this particular topic. And I asked this question, and many Jewish women, that was interviewing women, it was a survey. So the majority of Jewish women, when I asked about their race, the categories were, the census categories are an other, and they put other. Though I would phenotypically describe them as white. So in many ways, what I struggle with I think there's so much to really unpack here. In large part, there's a lot of conversation now, what we call about Jews of color. So who is a Jew of color? What does that mean, right? Is it somebody that gets a is not accepted by a Jewish community? Is it someone that faces bias or discrimination, microaggression? Is it someone that doesn't have the same kind of life chances? Or is it somebody that's a Jew from Mexico that might read as white, but identifies differently? One of the things that we have here in the United States is that race and ethnicity it's self-identified. So it used to be, at the beginning of the century, the census takers would go around and they would check off what you were, right? And Jewish, for example, was one of they would check off Jewish. Jews fought really hard to get that off the census, to be seen as not a race. In large part, this happened during as a result of what was happening over in Europe in the Holocaust. But today we get to choose. So we get to choose on forms, but then is it accepted or not? I can stop there and take more questions.
That's absolutely great. I know that in the Latino community that there is a population undercount in the United States, and I feel that there's a definite connection with choosing the other, or something that is not as reflective, or they want it to be reflective in this other way. So very good question. And Gabriel, I see that you have a second question. Please go ahead and unmute and go ahead and ask it.
Okay, thank you so much. Hi, Laura. My name's Gabby. Gabrielle is my full name, so it shows up on Zoom. I got a master's degree at Brandeis and did my undergrad there. I saw you studied there too. My question, to not take up so much of your time, is earlier when you were talking about synagogues as kind of the center of Jewish identity, I was just kind of curious more into your background, your thinking, and what the research showed there, just because as a millennial Jew, most of my friends are not a part of synagogues, yet I still feel like the Jewish culture, secular culture, and Jewish identity is very strong with those. So I was just curious for you to talk a little bit more about synagogues' role in Jewish identity.
Sure. And I think you're right. I mean, I think that folks have strong Jewish identities without necessarily being affiliated, right? And actually, there's so much research out of Brandeis that talks about this a lot. So I think that's a very, very, very good point. So I think what I really want to think about is ways where Jewish networks are built that are not necessarily around the synagogues, and ways to be affiliated and continued entrenched networks that don't revolve around the synagogue. So, there's Jewish summer camps. There was so much research about Jewish summer camps, right? But what we know is that actually Jewish summer camps don't promote lifelong Jewish networks, even though we think it would. In large part, it has to do with the fact that people marry later. And I say this, sending my kids to Jewish summer camps, and it doesn't mean that it doesn't promote a Jewish identity. It just doesn't necessarily promote Jewish networks in ways that happens in Latin America. I think other ways that Latin America has strong institutions in large part has to do with the fact that, you know, if you can afford private school, you will, in many ways. Not all people do, and the Jewish day school in the United States, the Jewish day schools in the United States are they're just not as accessible. There's just not as many of them. We see the same thing with the sort of JCCs. Oftentimes people say, oh, I just go to the gym there. So they exist, but they're not the kind of locus around which community is built. Does that make more sense?
Yes, I see what you mean.
But I think that absolutely, and there's strong Jewish identities. But I do want to think back about this idea of Jewish values, right? What does it mean to have Jewish values? Are Jewish values very different from, and I would say what we call Jewish values, social justice, and you know, the majority of Jews still vote Democrat, even though, you know, we do have some sort of folks that have moved to the right. All of these racial justice, are they so different from sort of larger liberal progressive values, right? How are they different? I would argue they're not different, right? What is a Jewish value? How is it different? What's intrinsically Jewish about it today? This was maybe not the case 80 years ago, but how is it different today?
Very nice, very nice. If there are any other questions, please feel free to unmute yourself or type it in the chat. We still have a couple of minutes left. I would absolutely love to take this time to continue discussion with Laura. Laura, I have my own question that is tangential to this conversation. One particularly on the difference between Latino and Latinx. It's one that I run into. I'll be honest, I say Latinx around my white progressive friends, and I say Latino around my Latino friends. And I feel like I have to code switch that way. So please, what have you learned? What do you see? What are your thoughts on that?
I think we're on the same page. You know, I've been thinking a lot about this also in large part because people don't describe themselves as Latinx. Mm-hmm. People also don't often describe themselves as Latino, though I would argue that over time, the future you know, the like second or third generations are much more likely to describe themselves as Latino than their parents. Mm-hmm. And I also strongly believe that there is a strong Latino cultural ethnicity. But one of the ways that I've been thinking about it is, in many ways, you know, it's largely, Latinx has largely come out of the academy, which I find a little bit problematic, because if people are not necessary, if it doesn't come, if the people that it's describing haven't adopted it or it's come from them, then we're imposing a label. But at the same time, I've thought deeply about how to be inclusive of people that are often excluded.
Right.
So that's how I try to think about it. But I think with my friends that are, there's this idea of code switching is so interesting. And I would argue that it happens so much more than we think it does. Mm-hmm. And which is one of the ways, and you know, if I were to, you know, or maybe I'll write another book on sort of this kind of code switching. But we do this as Jews, right? I often take on a Jewish persona sometimes, and I think I talk to people about, you know, my summer camp in JCC, and then when I'm with my friends that are, you know, Mexican or Argentine, people tell me my voice, I mean, in Spanish, my voice sounds different. My topics are different. I speak about different things. I say things that I might not say to my American Jewish friends. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's part of this sort of in-between status that a lot of us face, a lot of people that are not part of the larger white majority face oftentimes. Absolutely.
Right. Jeremy, I saw that you had unmuted for a second. Did you have a thought or a question?
Oh, I was just thinking about, you know, there's a rise in conversions to Islam in the Latino community on average nationwide, and I'm wondering how that compares with Judaism in particular.
So I don't know too much about it, Jeremy, but but really anecdotally, and this is a lot of people reach out to me and they say, oh, my parents were, or my grandparents were conversos. Conversos were people that had converted, had come over from the Iberian Peninsula and at some point converted, and some kept practiced their Jewish faith in secret. And there's a number of, I think, organizations, particularly in like New Mexico, for example, or in the Southern United States, that research this, and people see it as coming back to their roots, right? That their roots are really Jewish, or their great grandparents were Jewish, and they're not necessarily converting, though I think many of them have to go through a formal conversion ceremony. But that's really the most I know about it, and I think that there are people that sorry, now I'm reading the chat. I can't do two things at once. This was, life after 40 something. But yes, yeah. So I think that's what I know about it. Sort of conversos coming back to their faith. But one of the things that I think is happening a lot, for example, in Latin America, and I don't know about it here, is that there are people that would like to there are indigenous groups that want to convert to Judaism, and the Jewish communities are not necessarily very welcoming.
Interesting, thank you.
Ali is putting the survey link in the chat. Please, if you enjoyed it and if you had learned something from this event, please jump on into that link and fill out the form. It really does help. We literally do jump in there and learn from it and make our programs better. So we do look at our surveys, and not just something that we do. So please click that link and do it. Laura, thank you so very much for this conversation tonight. Any last words you want to leave us with?
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being open-minded. I hope I've given you things to think about, right? Some things that are a little bit provocative, which I think are okay. I think I do want to say that the best way to sort of dismantle really this racist structure that exists is to be uncomfortable, right?
Mm-hmm.
And dig deep.
Absolutely.
And begin to build bridges.
I absolutely love it. Building bridges between people. It's what we do. And I'm glad that that's also what you do. Everybody have a great night. Be safe, and we'll see each other soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.